This is our lecture covering chapter 16 from your book on writing research reports and the American Psychological Association, or APA style. Ultimately, when we conduct research without a written report, the most groundbreaking findings in the world go undocumented. The perfect experiment remains unknown, and new theoretical perspectives are essentially unrealized until you disseminate the information to the scientific community, to other researchers. It ultimately does not have a lot of value. There's a saying in songwriting that it's not a song until you play it for somebody else. And I think that there's something to be said for this idea that science is effectively a communal practice. It's something that we do as a society, as a discipline that works and collaborates together. So essentially, one of the most important aspects of conducting science is sharing the findings and the information with others. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of how we go about doing that, including the formatting guidelines from the APA. We're also going to talk a little bit about the ethics of how we document material in our reports and the perils of plagiarism in all its forms. So each section of an empirical report or a journal article we're going to go over in some detail and talk about some specifics of what's supposed to be contained in that document. So the American Psychological Association format gives us a blueprint for our papers and what they're going to look like. We've talked about these sections a little bit in previous chapters as well. And it's basically a shorthand that contains some basic formatting rules, as well as some principles for scientific writing within the field of psychology. So there are several resources that exist, including the publication manual of the APA, which was recently the new edition came out in 2019. There's also a couple of other additional books listed here. Concise Rules of APA Style is one, which is very popular. There's also a lot of computer-aided guides for meeting APA style as well, and things online. So as I mentioned, the APA guidelines involve formatting rules, very technical, specific things about what the paper should physically look like, things like spacing and formatting, but it also talks a lot about the nature of what our reports should read like, how they should be structured and written. So first and foremost, as is the case in all science, it's incredibly important to focus on being concise and clear, and in some ways in being interesting. It's very easy, especially when you're very deep into a subject, that it can become very dry and too technical and really push the reader away. I mean, now you are writing for a professional audience when you write journal articles, so it's not the same way that you would write for something like in a more secondary source magazine or online on a blog or on a website. But you are writing for other professionals, so there are certain expectations of understanding that are contained therein. But it should be interesting to the reader, and it should draw them in to some degree. Of course, a researcher should also really strive to utilize inclusive and sensitive language, and being precise in their language, and really being up to date on the most appropriate terms and terminology for the variety of things we discuss in psychology. So when you cite a reference, for example, this is a very specific process that's detailed in the APA guide. As we've discussed in your introduction and in other aspects, other parts of the article, you're going to cite references from existing literature in the body of science that in that area. So typically these are going to be other journal articles or potentially chapters of textbooks or books on specific subjects. The reason why we do this is because, as we've discussed in previous chapters, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. That science is an iterative process, a process of building knowledge and information about a particular topic. So we are always building upon the existing literature. We're always going back to the existing body of knowledge and seeing what's already been established, what's been ruled out, what's controversial, what hasn't been addressed. Sometimes we're looking for absences in the body of knowledge, but we're always utilizing primary sources, and then we have to document that within the paper. The reason why we're doing that is to show the logical flow of your understanding of a subject, where your theoretical orientation comes from, why you make certain choices in your design, or why you operationalize variables in specific ways. And all of those things are supported and substantiated by evidence. And so that introduction, as we've mentioned, is sort of like making your case for the rest of the article. And it's really important that we cite it appropriately so that the reader can then go and look at those sources themselves. That's part of that iterative communicative process in science as well. A question that I often get from people, students in the class is, you know, if I cite something, what does that mean? Well, it should mean, at least in a professional setting or even as a student, what it should mean is that you have read that article firsthand. What you're not doing is going to someone else's introduction, someone else's article that cited that reference and citing it as well. You should have the actual article in hand, virtually, digitally, or in paper. But the idea is that when you cite something, you are making it implicit that you have read that article, that you have read that information yourself directly. So without reading the paper firsthand, you may very unwittingly or unintentionally misconstrue its contents, misrepresent it in some way. And if a paper is cited based on the information in a different paper, there is a format we use. We can say, we're citing this previous citation in another article, but we have to sort of document that and make it very clear that's what we're doing. Otherwise, the understanding and the implicit understanding is that you yourself have physically read that article. So proper documentation it's essential. It's an ethical imperative. It's really crucial that what's represented in a journal article is your ideas, your thoughts, your sentences, your phrases, and your word choices. All of that needs to be clearly separated from those other sources. So when you're citing someone, or when you're just sort of borrowing existing language, it's important that you don't present it as your own without, you need to offer proper citation. You're not presenting it as your own. If it is something that you've come up with originally and it's your thinking, then that's fine. Then that doesn't require a citation. But if you are utilizing someone else's existing research, or even just phraseology or terminology, whatever, especially whole cloth sentences or paragraphs, you have to document that appropriately in your paper. So plagiarism is when this is not done properly. This is a serious ethical and legal problem. It can result in a lot of incredible negative consequences for you if you engage in plagiarism. As you're all very well aware, every university has strong rules regarding plagiarism. Excuse me. And as time has gone on, we've seen that the technology allows plagiarism to be detected more effectively, and just the dissemination of information over the internet. Within certain circles of people, when it was a relatively tiny group of people that had access through university subscriptions in the libraries to these journals, the dissemination was much smaller. Now, when these things are readily accessible, and more importantly, there are all forms of applications and artificial intelligence and all these different things we can utilize to just preemptively scan information and look for plagiarism. We do this with papers that are turned in a university setting, and you can be absolutely positive that a journal, before it publishes a manuscript, is going to run it through their own software to make sure that it doesn't contain any plagiarized material. If you do plagiarize, it has, like I said, very serious consequences: expulsion from school, failing a class, losing a job, and of course litigation for violating copyright laws. You're opening yourself up to possible civil suits from the original authors of the information if you're presenting it as your own. There's also the issue of your professional reputation. Having a charge of plagiarism that's substantiated upon you could potentially destroy your ability to get other articles published in journals, throughout the course of a career. So it has very serious implications. But more importantly, I want to come at it from the ethical principle of integrity. You don't present ideas that are not your own as your own. You document that you're utilizing someone else's work. So when you're engaging in writing in a journal article, obviously, as I've said, there's a little bit of a paradox where we are building upon the work of others, we're citing others' work, but we're supposed to also be creating our own work. So when you want to cite someone, it's not as simple as just pulling a huge section whole cloth, throwing it in quotation marks, and then putting a citation. There is an art form and a technique to good scientific writing, and it really involves this idea of paraphrasing in a meaningful way, in a way that might be interpretive, in a way that might be your own thoughts being included or your own interpretations being included, but more importantly, just a style of if I'm going to put things in quotation marks, that's one thing, but if I'm not going to put them in quotation marks, there is a process of paraphrasing and making it your own with a proper citation, of course. So the rule of thumb that has been presented by the authors of the textbook is this idea: 3 or more consecutive words in a sentence that are the same as those in the original source need to be in quotation marks and cited appropriately. That's a pretty high bar. When you think about it, when you go to write your research proposal for this class, for example, your introduction, you may find that it's difficult to sort of look at a piece of scientific writing and paraphrase it in a way that is meaningful to the reader and that makes sense to you and that you're able to interpret it in some way. It can be very challenging, but I think that having a very high bar is a way of protecting yourself. It essentially makes it very difficult. If you were to follow this policy, for example, it makes it very difficult to inadvertently, accidentally commit any plagiarism. So holding yourself to a very high standard actually protects you quite a bit professionally. So there are, as I said, some kind of logistical semantic things that are involved in APA format. There are some very basic things that are established as a standard, and this is basically when we're talking about a submission of a journal article or turning in a paper for a class that requires APA format. These are the things you're expected to do. So first and foremost, obviously, it's typed. These days, it would be pretty unusual for someone to submit like a long handwritten report, but there was certainly a time years ago when people would try to submit legal pads longhand written who were Luddites who didn't want to utilize a computer or in that case a typewriter. Obviously before the personal computer, this was all done through typewriters, but the idea that they're typed, meaning that there's not a lot of room for misinterpretation and that things are very clearly delineated by virtue of being typed and consistent. Double spacing is standard, using a 12-point serif font, so you don't have to use one specific font, but it does need to meet that criteria. You utilize 1-inch margins on all 4 sides. You write in a way that is left aligned, not justified, with one exception, which is the abstract. We'll talk about that in a moment. But everything else in your paper is meant to be left aligned in terms of the format. All pages are numbered consecutively and in a very specific way. Page numbers are included on the top margin, 1 inch from the right, starting on the title page. There's also something called a running head, which is sort of a brief summary of the title of the article that you'll sometimes see, or you will see, in the top right corner or on the top of the page as a way of sort of making sure if a page is lost, for example, of a physical copy, then you know where it belongs and what it belongs to. These are all just kind of formatting specifics. There are lots of examples within your textbook. You can also obviously go to some of the journal articles we've discussed in the class or that you find yourself through PsycInfo, and you'll recognize these formats are also reproduced then in the context of how they're printed in a journal. So we've discussed this before, but let's go through it in some more detail for the purposes of this chapter. These are the main sections, the organizational scheme for an APA format article or paper for a class in this case. The title, the title page, excuse me, the abstract, the introduction, the method, the results, the discussion, and the references. These are the major sections. The title page includes the title of the report. Believe it or not. What's interesting about the title page, and there is an art form to title writing. A lot of times in psychology, especially in modern psychology, we are analyzing relatively complex variables, things that are difficult to sort of shorten to very simple terms. Now, when you get into a study that involves more than one variable, obviously a traditional experiment is at the very least going to have an independent variable and a dependent variable that need to be included to one degree or another within the title of the article. Now, once you start involving multiple variables, multifactorial designs, or when you're involving other more complex relationships between variables, as you can imagine, that title can get very long and very cumbersome. I believe that the title of my PhD dissertation was, oh gosh, I'm going to forget it now, but it was like personality, expectancy, motivation, and its contribution to drug use problems and blah, 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 blah. I mean, it was very long because I was looking at multiple variables in the sort of multivariate regressions that I was running. And so a good title conveys specific information about the topic of the study. It is relatively succinct. And yet it tends to capture everything. So there's a Goldilocks spot here. You don't want to have a vague title. You don't want to have a title that leaves out core information, key aspects of what the paper is about. So you want it to be exhaustive and inclusive of everything that you're looking at, but you also want it to be readable, not too cumbersome, and not too long. So there is a process of trying to pare that down and expand it out to make it fit that parameter. And it's not as easy as it sounds, but ultimately sometimes finding the title is a way of sort of bringing some clarity and some focus to what the article is about, and it should do that for the reader as well. Now, underneath the title of the report on the title page, let me skip here to the next slide. You will have the author's name and the school or their organized affiliation. So if I were to be publishing an article, these days I would most likely be doing it under the heading of the Salem VA Medical Center. If I were publishing it when I was in graduate school, it'd be under Virginia Tech. So your name is usually associated with your organizational affiliation, whether that's a university or not. As I said, the running head is the short title of the paper, which is no more than 50 characters in length. You list that on the title page, and then it appears at the top of every page of the article submission. This is a brief summary, like, for example, mine might become motivations for drug use, something relatively quick and dirty that will fit in a small space at the top of the page. And then, of course, page headers and page numbers, which you can, again, look at specific examples of this within your textbook. We've talked about the abstract. This is presented on the second page of a traditional APA format article. It is essentially a less than 120 word summary of the entire paper, and it includes information from all the major sections: the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion of the paper. So what you'll find is that there is a sentence, maybe 2 sentences designated to each of those major sections, because 120 words is very brief. So it needs to fit into a very small space, and it needs to cover a lot of territory. So again, there's an art form to writing an abstract and summarizing. Now, as you can imagine, generally speaking, the last thing you write is the abstract. You have to have completed all the major sections of the paper before you know what to boil down and include in an abstract. The abstract is often also center justified. It's kind of floating in the middle of the page. It has a different formatting style compared to the rest of the paper. That's just a convention established by the APA. So the introduction, as we've discussed in previous chapters, this is really where you start out. Remember the hourglass structure we discussed in the chapter on correlation? It had that sort of section tacked on in the back about APA style. That was I think they needed that in order to talk about it throughout the rest of the textbook. And then this chapter at the end is the more specific, deep dive into this. But ultimately, the introduction starts broad in that hourglass structure. It is very theoretical, and it's a description of the research question, the existing body of knowledge surrounding the research question, and the principal problem that you're investigating in the study. So it's telling the reader, why is the study needed? What is the purpose of the study, and how it's going to be conducted. It's really going to ground your journal article in the context of the existing literature. You are building the argument, you are establishing the foundation that leads up to your particular study. And it includes a brief overview of the plan of the study, not the methods per se, but just a narrative of what the study is planning to do. It also includes the main hypothesis or hypotheses, if there are multiple ones, for the paper. Typically speaking, that will be in the last paragraph of the introduction leading into the methods section. So after the introduction establishes sort of the purpose of the study and the theoretical foundation and the existing literature, we move into the methods. This is the narrowing of the hourglass at the center, where it becomes very specific, along with the results section. So oftentimes the method is written first, not necessarily entirely, but you may start thinking about the study you want to conduct and developing aspects of the methods section even before you've fully fleshed out the introduction. I would argue that perhaps the introduction comes first, but sometimes until you've designed a method, you don't know what issues you need to address in the introduction. So there's probably a lot of iterative parallel processing that goes on, but the method, along with the introduction, is the first parts that are going to be written. And so while the study is being conducted, the methods section is kind of thought of as an evolving document that serves as the official record. It behooves you as a researcher to write parts of the methods section as the study is happening, as it's developing, as it's being conducted, because things get forgotten. Sometimes these research studies go on for long periods of time, especially if it's a longitudinal study. So traditionally, the methods section is meant to sort of be the official record and documentation of what's going on within the study. So it's often being written as the study is ramping up and then being conducted. So it documents the procedures, the measures, and the actions of the participants, and it's really divided into these 4 subsections we've talked about. The participants, the materials, or the apparatus, traditionally it used to be called in some cases, the design, and the procedure. You will sometimes see the materials section written as instruments or that kind of thing, because you're describing what sort of questionnaires you're using, what sort of measurement techniques you're using, what sort of it's tied to the procedure in the sense of if you're going to use a functional MRI as part of your procedure for on brain chemistry or brain activity, you would want to talk here about the MRI machine itself and how it was utilized and that kind of thing. If you're going to utilize a questionnaire that's well established, the materials section, or the measure section as it's also sometimes referred to, would really allow you to go into detail about which measures are being used and why. So let's start with the first one though, with the participants. This is really describing your sample, right? You're talking about your particular sample. This is often where you're going to see a lot of those sort of descriptions about inclusion and exclusion criteria, about sampling methods. I think in a good study, there needs to be at least some statements about how did I get the sample, right? Now, we did note that in some of the older examples of research studies we read in class, for example, Elizabeth Loftus's first major article, she doesn't really talk about how they recruited those university students. And I think that that's an absence that wouldn't be tolerated in a publication today. The expectation is you need to talk about where you got them and how you recruited them. So ultimately, the main thing, of course, that needs to be known is what's the sample size, how many participants were in the study, who were they, how were they selected and recruited, and then important characteristics about the participants. And then finally, you'll usually have a statement about IRB, or Institutional Review Board approval status, saying that this study was submitted to the institutional IRB. Sorry, that's redundant. This study was submitted to the IRB, who reviewed it and approved it prior to conducting it. Then we move on to the materials, and as I said, this often sometimes just includes the measures, but it's really the measures, the variables, the type of apparatus. For example, Stanley Milgram included his very detailed description of what the electric shock machine looked like in the study. So anything you're going to utilize, whether it's a pen and paper measure or a piece of technical equipment, is going to be described in this section. After you've described all the materials and the apparatus you may be using or stimuli you've produced for the study, for example, like in an alcohol research study in one of these sort of lab bars where they have a naturalistic observation of drinking behavior, you would describe the bar itself and what does it look like, this research setting that's been meant to look like a bar. But once you've done that, you're going to move on to talking about the design of the study. To back up for a moment, though, one thing you will do, I just want to reiterate this. In the materials section, in the measures part of that, you will talk about the specific measures that you're using, and you'll typically include a couple of important things. First and foremost, there'll be a reference, where there'll be a publication that's associated with that particular measure. And then usually you'll be referencing some reliability or validity articles that are specifically focused on that measure. So sometimes you'll be introducing something like what's called Cronbach's alpha, which is a reliability statistic. We've talked about it way back in the measurement chapter. So in that material section, you will provide that information, basically saying this measure that I'm using is established and has validity. If you're using a pre-existing measure, if you're making up your own measure, then you need to have a more lengthy discussion of what it is, what it looks like, how you developed it, if you piloted it, and in the end, once you conducted the study, did you do any statistical testing on the measure to look at things like reliability or validity? So moving on to design, this is where you talk about the structure of the study. So in an experiment, you would say, this is we utilized a randomized controlled experiment or a true experimental design. If it's quasi-experimental, if it's correlational, whatever it is, this is entailed and described in this section about the design. So you would talk about things like what are the independent and dependent variables? What are the levels of those independent variables? Is it a between or within subjects design? So you really want the reader to understand exactly how you designed and then ultimately carried it out. The procedure section that follows is the detailed sequence of the steps of the study. What exactly did you do? So what's really important here, I think, as I mentioned, this is the official record of the article. One of the things we discussed early on in this class was the idea that a key principle of science is publicness, skepticism, peer review, right? The fact that this is all done out in the open and above board. It is not enough to simply report your results and your interpretations. That is not considered, fully scientific by nature of how we write articles in psychology. You need to have a full section of methods that explains to the reader exactly what you did and how. That's for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, that transparency allows for a skeptical review of the article. There may be things that you did that introduce confounds. There may be problems or questions, maybe simply, that the reader has that are not covered. If they don't have this detailed description of all these aspects of the method, then they don't know to ask those questions, and they can only make assumptions, and you want to be clear. So in the absence of a methods section, it really doesn't allow for criticism or feedback or an analysis or even just evaluation of what you've done in the study. And that's an important part of this process of science being public and part of a collaborative, iterative process. The other thing is that it allows for exact replication. The methods section should be written in such a way that any qualified researcher should be able to read your article and then perfectly replicate that study. So anything that needs to be known for someone to do that should be contained somewhere within this methods section. So after the methods section, we move on to the results, and this is really where you're going to summarize the findings and the statistical tests performed. You're not moving on to interpretation yet. You're still in the narrow band part of the hourglass. So you're only talking about the specific results of this particular study. It often includes a lot of technical language and statistical reports, lots of parentheticals with tons of numbers that you may or may not recognize at this point, depending on your level of comfort with statistics. You'll see a lot of p-values. You'll see a lot of, like F-test will have an F statistic, T-test will have a T included in there. Things like degrees of freedom. There's all these technical statistical things that are included in this section as you report findings. And of course, you're going to talk about what test did you perform. So you're going to very clearly say, in this study we were examining these two independent variables and this dependent outcome, therefore we conducted a multivariate ANOVA analysis, and then you'll go on to report the details of that. Again, with publicness and transparency and integrity in research, one of the things is you report all relevant findings, even if they find nothing, even if they essentially are non-significant, or we might call null findings. The idea being that we don't just report the good and throw out the bad. It's important to report everything so that a reader can clearly and honestly just evaluate the study with all the information at hand. You don't report individual scores. You are reporting summaries, and so this is where you're going to see a lot of this descriptive statistics we discussed in the previous chapter. Things like reports about mean, median, and mode, or measures of central tendency, variability of the data, skewness of the data. You're really describing it, and you begin with those descriptive statistics first, and then you move into your discussion of the inferential statistics that you conducted for hypothesis testing. You have to assume, as I said, that your audience is a professional, semi-professional, or academic audience. So you don't have to explain every detail of what a test is. You can simply say what you used. The idea being that the reader has a basic knowledge of statistics. Now, these days, especially more and more in psychology, we're seeing more advanced statistical methods, things like structural equation modeling and linear regression models that are far more complex. If you are utilizing something very complex, it's definitely worthwhile to include at least a sentence or two, just giving the reader a sense of what this test is and why it was applied. You can assume they have heard of it and know what it is, but you don't assume they're a statistician and have every degree of comfort and knowledge of all of these tests. So sometimes there'll be a structured series of sentences in this section that'll say, after consultation with a statistician, we decided to utilize a blah, 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 blah model, and the reason being that blah, 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 blah. So you're sort of justifying and explaining why you used it and why it's relevant. But if you're reporting something like a simple correlation coefficient, a t-test, an f-test, an ANOVA, a multivariate regression, something that's relatively mainstream and common, you're not really required to just define it. You can just simply present it. And again, remember, you're not including any in-depth interpretations or conclusions about what these results mean. You're simply just explaining what they are, and talking only in terms of the actual results within this study, not what it means in the larger hypothetical construct world we're going to move into. So this is this is the end of the narrowing of the hourglass, and then we begin to expand out in the discussion where we talk about interpretation. So what you're doing in this section is you're evaluating the results. Okay, you're interpreting the findings. Oftentimes, you're drawing conclusions about constructs related to the data, and of course, you're detailing the implications of the findings. What do these findings mean? So you are essentially you're expanding out from that very narrow, specific middle of the hourglass back out to the wider context of what these findings mean. So there's a nice natural progression from the introduction to the discussion where things start theoretical and general, they narrow, and then they expand back out, referencing back to the introduction. Based upon the existing body of knowledge, we endeavored to carry out this study. Based upon these findings, we interpret that these variables are related in this way, and here's why, or what this means for our understanding of theory, of what these constructs, how they really relate to one another in a construct level. We're not just talking about operationalized numbers now. A few recommendations from your book about what should be applied to the discussion section, and I think these are good guides. First of all, a modest conservative style. You don't want to overstate the importance of the results. You want to be as objective as you can. If you find something that does not fit your original hypothesis, this is a good place to offer an explanation as to why. Not just the ones, as I said, you don't throw out the data that doesn't support your findings in the results section. You also don't throw out the implications of the data that doesn't support your findings in the discussion section. You're obligated to talk about it. And this gives you an opportunity to potentially defend that finding, say, well, maybe my theory is not entirely wrong, or maybe there's a reason why we didn't get support, and I think it's this. The idea being that you are, modifying, evaluating the theory, but you're not necessarily throwing it out. You're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But you do have to address findings that don't fit the original hypothesis. You are going to, in the discussion section, you're going to reference relevant studies that can help the reader to understand how the results from the study fit with the scientific literature on the topic. So if you found something consistent with what's really established in the existing literature, you want to make that connection in the discussion section. Another important aspect of this section is discussing limitations and weaknesses of the study. No study is perfect. Even in its inception, there are things that are limitations, practically, financially, time-wise. Those are going to be discussed here. But also, if there were things that did not go the way you expected in the course of the study, maybe it was really difficult to recruit and you ended up with a smaller sample than you would have liked based upon your power analysis. You might say, well, we didn't find the relationship, but we also were only able to gather this many subjects, but our power analysis said we needed this many. So maybe this relationship still exists, but what we're dealing here is a type 2 error. We rejected the null when in fact there might be a valid relationship there. So limitations and weaknesses are really important because the reader is going to, and most readers, especially peer reviewers for the journal itself, are going to find weaknesses and limitations of the study. If you address them yourself and discuss them honestly and openly and fairly in the discussion section, in a way, you are taking some of the steam out of possible criticism of this article. But you're saying, no, I actually considered that, I thought of it, I understand that it's a limitation, and I'm addressing it, and I'm being upfront about it. In doing so, in a way, it's a way of defending the strength of your article. It's not a weakness to identify that it has weaknesses. It's rather a strength of saying, I understand how science works. I understand that no study is perfect, that there's always chance and error and biases, and I'm going to acknowledge that in my discussion. And then another thing that's really important is you want to talk about sort of real life implications for this research. What does this mean not just for other researchers, but for policy, for how we conduct therapy, whatever it is you're studying, right? How we educate our children, if you're doing developmental research. So there's all these attempts that should be made to connect the research not just to other existing research or future implications for research, but to what it means for us practically in a practical significance in the real world. You also want to talk about unresolved or new problems revealed by the study. The reason why this is very important is this is what spurs the next study. Right? Implications for future research is a great aspect of this this sort of collaborative, iterative scientific process that we're working on here. The idea is that the person reading the article says, wow, that was a really interesting study. They did some cool things. I saw some problems with it, but it got me thinking. They didn't look at this, or they had an interesting finding that makes me think this needs to be explored further, or there were limitations to this study. I want to replicate it, but I want to fix those limitations. I want to address those limitations. It spurs on further research. Now, sometimes the same researchers are going to recognize those limitations and look at interesting new problems or implications, and that leads to their next study. But it also provides inspiration and ideas and sort of a stimulus for other researchers to then move on and continue to build the body of knowledge. Finally, you have a reference section. So remember that within the body of the text, there's these citations. Those citations take a very simple form. It's usually one or the other of these two examples here that you're seeing. You will do something like Strock, Martin, and Schwartz, parenthetical, the year of the publication, reported that blah, 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 blah. Or you can say previous research, and then the entire name and year is contained in a parenthetical, suggests that blah, 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 blah. The idea then is that that's enough information for your reader to then go to your complete reference list at the end of the paper and find the full reference, right? So not just, they'll look for alphabetically listed, and then within those alphabetical listings, it's usually chronological. They'll go to your reference page and find Strock, Martin, Schwartz that was from 1988, and they'll be able to see what the title of the article is, where it was published, what year, exactly where to find it in the journal, that kind of thing. One question that comes up from students a fair amount is this idea of utilizing the Latin abbreviation et al. This happens a lot because there are frequently multiple authors. As you can imagine, the example study that I brought up for the class that I was the 6th or 7th author on had a total of, I think, 9 authors on it. You do not want to have to write out Stevens, Lash, DeMarce, Lozano, Jones, blah, 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 so on and so forth every single time you reference it. The first time it's cited in an article, you should include all of the names. Subsequently, if it has 3 or more authors, if it's not just Smith and Jones, but if it's Smith, Jones, and Brown, I'm just utilizing sort of these very stereotypical sort of Anglo-Saxon names, but being a Jones, I have that tendency, I guess. The idea is that you can then utilize et al. As an abbreviation. So the first time you cite it, you need to say Strock, Martin, and Schwartz, 1988. Subsequently, you can say Strock et al., 1988. That will allow your reader to say, okay, that's the first time I've noticed that. Let me go back and find the full within the text, and then I can go to the reference page and find the whole thing. Once you finish your discussion section, there's usually a page break. There is not usually, there always is a page break, and then in the next page begins at the top of that with your references after the discussion. It only contains references that are cited in the paper. A lot of times when we're doing research in psychology and we're in that initial phase of literature review, where we're going through and finding tons and tons of articles, sometimes what people do is they start building their references page in advance. They're just going to go ahead, oh, this is a really crucial article, I'm going to use this. And then as time goes on, they end up not using it, they cut it for some reason. As it turns out, they look at it more in depth and it doesn't support what they thought it did, or it's not as relevant as they thought, and they end up not using it in the paper. It's very important that before you submit a publication, you make sure that every reference on your reference list has a referent within the body of the text. So, that the only thing you're citing in that reference page is what you actually discussed within the body of the article. There's a general format for journal articles this is discussed in greater detail in your book, but it generally goes this way. Author's last name, first initial, date of publication, title of publication, journal title, which is usually italicized, journal volume, which issue is also italicized, and then the specific page numbers. And here's an example. Nestor PG, Kubicki M, Guerrera RJ. I'm not even going to try and pronounce, Niznikowicz M, Fruman, blah, 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 blah. Neuropsychological correlates of diffusion, tensor imaging, and schizophrenia. Now, normally this little section here where it says neuropsychology and 18 would be italicized. I think that's just a typo on my part. And then the page numbers. This is the general format for a journal article. If you're citing a book, an article from online, or from a database, a web resource, a conference talk, a poster, whatever, there is a different format for each of those that are all sort of clearly delineated and plenty of examples within the APA publication guide. It's also referenced in your book quite a bit. There's some resources there. I believe in the appendix of the book, there's a lot of information about APA as well. So this is the page where you ultimately say, this is the official documentation of all of the literature that was reviewed and utilized and presented within the body of this article. So we're really focusing in this chapter, we're talking about what we might call a research article or a journal article, right? The type of article that is summarizing a particular study or a set of a few studies for the purposes of publication in a journal. If you remember going all the way back to our chapter, I think it's chapter 3 on literature review, there are also review articles. So that is a different type of publication. There are certain journals that only publish review articles, and then sometimes you'll see them sort of peppered within a journal that publishes primarily, research articles, experiment reports. A literature review follows a less rigid pattern than a traditional journal article, but it still has to follow APA formatting, and it still has a general structure to it that most readers of this type of scientific knowledge, this type of research, are going to recognize. So before you begin a literature review article, of course, you need to select a topic that's from a well-defined and studied area. You can't very well review literature if there's not much out there. It doesn't make for a very substantial paper. It also doesn't provide much support for whatever argument you're making within your literature review. A lot of people start a literature review by identifying one or more really pivotal articles or seminal articles, one that's very representative of important work in the area. Usually it's well known, and it's kind of the hinge for the entire paper. So it's a lot of times that's the kicking off point for writing a literature review, is to identify the seminal or pivotal articles and then select relevant articles surrounding that theoretically. Ones that are useful, ones that are representative, ones that are well structured. Part of writing a literature review is that you yourself are evaluating those articles before you decide to include them. If you recognize major problems or confounds or limitations, perhaps that's not a good article to include. You want to include the most robust, scientifically well-defined articles that you can. You're going to start reading, looking for the key features of the article by section. So usually a literature review has sections. You might define the multiple variables and what they mean in the research, and then talk about how they're related. It should have a natural flow to it. It should read very much like a position paper. You're making an argument based upon the existing literature, and here is the foundational support for it. You read for content, you read for depth. You're looking for things like construct and internal validity within the studies. You're also looking for external validity and generalizability. Is this an article that makes sense to include in a literature review, or is it too specific to just this particular sample or population? I think it's important that when you're writing a literature review, you still have a research question or a problem. It's not just an overview altogether of whatever's in that area. You should have a position. You should have a thesis or a thing you're presenting within it, an argument, so to speak, or a theoretical approach. And you really want to narrow that down enough so that you can review all or most of the relevant research in that area. If it's too broad, you're setting yourself up for failure, because it's impractical. It's too hard to read all the relevant literature. So finding that balance between specificity and generality is really important. If it's too specific, as I said, there won't be enough literature to build upon. If it's too general, you're going to be sort of lost in a sea of all these possible references. So narrowing it down to a healthy degree to a specific research question that is incorporated in by virtually all of those articles that you're going to talk about. They're looking at essentially the same research question, perhaps in one way or another. You describe those studies in detail. You identify the relationships between them, how they're connected, how they're consistent, how they're inconsistent. You look for gaps in the literature, places where research is missing. That also is a place where we can often find ideas for future research. We go to literature reviews and they say, unfortunately, there's really not much out there regarding how X and Y are related. further research needs to be conducted. Well, that's your cue right there. If you're interested in that subject, that might be a really good place to go for ideas. And then you often talk about how research problems can be ameliorated or rectified, how things that are going on in the research that are not providing the support that you'd like for your argument, how that can be fixed by further research. A subtype of APA formatting we should talk about, because it's something that you are potentially very likely to come across, especially if you continue your study in psychology, or if you go to graduate school, of course, is poster presentations. Now, of course, poster presentations are much less common during COVID right now. They're done virtually, as is most everything like this class. But essentially, poster presentations are a great opportunity at conferences for people to communicate with one another, to network, to connect. A poster presentation is essentially a brief summary of what could very well turn into a larger article. It's an effective and economical way to present research. And quite literally, if you go to the ground floor of Williams, across from the undergraduate office, they have, in the copy room, they have a giant printer that they utilize primarily for printing these posters. And so you roll up your poster, you put it in a cardboard tube, and you fly to wherever or drive to wherever, and you go to a conference. You've submitted your poster, it's been accepted, and you're given a booth, and you go and you set up your poster, and you stand there, and you have a handout, and you talk about it to people that stop by. And there's these poster sessions, and they're organized by area of research usually. So people that are interested in that area of research can then go walk around and talk to people and look at posters and ask questions. So it can be a very a very social process that is a great way to interact with other people. It's also a great way to meet other people from other universities and institutions that are studying the same things. You may end up finding a collaborative partner who wants to work on an article together with you, or do some collaborative research across multiple sites. So it's a really cool and effective way to further the body of knowledge. A poster essentially includes the same sections as an empirical paper with a lot less detail, because it has to fit onto one poster and be readable. It usually includes simple tables or figures, so you have some kind of visual aspect so that your poster is not just overwhelmingly a ton of text. It's a little more attractive to the person viewing it. And it's something they can kind of latch onto and ask questions about. And typically what you have is a handout that you can give to people who are interested. And sometimes that is a smaller copy of the poster, but typically it's a more text-heavy page that includes all the same information, but it also includes contact information for you. So that person might pick that up at the conference, and a day or a week or a month or years later, they might say, oh, now that I'm looking at this area of study, I wonder if this person has any insight or any recommendations or has any ideas. And as I said, that can often lead to a collaboration within the research field, or consultation with one another, and having those more personal relationships that allow you to sort of connect with other people within the scientific field. A poster can have a layout that looks something like this. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule that it has to have this particular structure, but generally speaking, these are the sections that will be included in one form or another. Your abstract, your methods, your figure or table of some sort, a discussion, introduction, results, another figure or table, a conclusion. So as you can see, it kind of reiterates a lot of the things that you're going to see within a journal article. It just does it in a more concise way. And usually, obviously it's printed in large type. Any person walking by can stop and stare at it and look at it and read these sections, relatively easily. And it gives them a sense of what your overall research is about. Sometimes a poster is a preliminary way of reporting your findings before you write a full article and submit it for publication. So sometimes you'll see posters that are about pilot studies. Sometimes you'll see them as a summary to sort of like lead the person into further research you're going to do, or that you already have done. It's also a great way for graduate students and undergraduate students and other professionals within the field to establish their curriculum vitae, their resume. You will typically have on your CV, your curriculum vitae in psychology, that's more standard than a quote-unquote resume, which is more of like a business model. You will have a list of all of the publications that you're associated with, and that would include journal articles and book chapters you've contributed to and all that. But there's also a section for poster presentations. When I review internship submissions for the Salem VA Hospital, one of the things we look at and one of the things we rate candidates on is publications. How much research have they done? And we give weight to poster presentations, maybe not as high as a publication in a peer-reviewed journal, but those poster presentation, those proposals for those posters are reviewed by conferences. There is a peer review process. If it's completely off the wall or it doesn't make sense within the context of what's going on at that conference, it won't be accepted. And there's a limited number of spots physically within, whatever hall you're at or whatever place you're presenting this. So there is a bit of a peer review process, and it does speak to someone having at least a viable idea for research to present. So it's a way to, establish your bona fides and give you an opportunity to have some things you can include on your curriculum vitae. So either as an undergraduate or if you go on further and pursue graduate school in psychology, I highly recommend that you look for opportunities to participate in poster presentations either at your university alone or at these larger conferences or organizational meetings that happen.